Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for what I promise will be a thought-provoking discussion on Asian Futurisms by our diverse group of panelists. My name is Mehrin Masud-Elias, but I go by Mir. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a lawyer by profession, a poet by calling, and a lifelong fan of all manners of futuristic and/or speculative fiction, art, filmmaking, etc., that go beyond the genre by commenting on the present and the past while purporting to show us a possible future. I would like to thank the tireless organizers of the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival, especially Arjang Zafar and Selena Yip, as well as Atif Sheikh, who, along with Aisha Zia Khan and myself, are the co-founders of 12 Gates Arts, the only nonprofit arts organization in the greater Philadelphia area, focusing on promoting and presenting the works of diasporic South and West Asian artists. Without all of them, this panel would not have been possible. And of course, many thanks to our wonderful panelists and to you, our audience, for joining us this Saturday. Before I introduce the topic briefly and our panelists, I would like to take a moment to remind us that we are celebrating Native American Heritage Month this November, and to acknowledge that I am joining you from the unceded territory of the Susquehannock peoples. This land was originally inhabited 12 to 18,000 years ago by ancestors of the Algonquin tribes, whose own distant ancestors, the first peoples in the landmass that we call North America, some 25,000 years ago, crossed over the land bridge that used to exist between Asia and North America. I also recognize the enduring biodiversity of this land and the many indigenous nations that stand in relation to it, particularly the thousands of indigenous children from dozens of different nations forced or coerced into the reprogramming camp established by the US government at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879, just a few miles away from where I am. Our desire to explore the contours of Asian futurisms was originally inspired by the concepts of both Afrofuturism and African futurism. As we've envisioned it thus far, but we'll learn more from our esteemed panelists, futurism could encompass any and all of the following: the queerness of time, as in its inherent elastic or nonlinear nature and ability to resist the hegemony of normativity, including the temporal drag, as originally explored by Elizabeth Freeman in Time Binds, of various pasts on the present moment and that of a diversity of such moments on possible futures. Futurism also encompasses the precarity of space, the ongoing dialogues among bodies, past, present, and future, as well as speculative recreations of the past to query both the present and project alternate arcs into the future. And even the utilization of straightforward speculative and/or science fiction in the Asian context is a form of futurism, absolutely. So as for Asian, we view this as the diverse context of lives of Asian origin and/or connection, including diasporic communities, disrupted and othered by war, colonization, migration, racism, homo and transphobia, misogyny, ableism, speciesism, anti-poor prejudices, climate change, among a myriad of other challenges. I hope that some or all of these resonate with you in some form or another. The thrust of the inquiry today will be how these futurisms are explored in the arts, whether literature, poetry, film, music, etc., with specific examples in the hopes of inspiring further conversations, creative works, and activism that go beyond this panel and this film festival and beyond Philadelphia. With that, I'd like to introduce you all to our first panelist, Jared Vadera. Jared is an artist and cultural producer whose work examines the way that images and technologies colonize vision. His work is influenced by science fiction, post and decolonial theory, Rorschach tests, Zen koans, and impossible objects. His prints, collages, sculptures, videos, and installations have been exhibited and screened at venues in the US, Canada, and India. Welcome, Jared.
Thanks for the wonderful introduction, Mir, and introduction to the conversation in general about Asian futurisms. It's something very near and dear to me, and something I think much more robust discussions can happen around. So thank you, Mir, Arzang, Atif, Aisha, and Selena for inviting me, and I look forward to the conversation. It's something I've been thinking about for the last 20 years or so in my work through my practice, and it's something that's had many different names. You're interested in science fiction, you're interested in decolonizing vision, radical imaginaries, but I'm curious and really excited about thinking through how this term makes sense today in relation to our work and the general kind of social challenges that we're facing as well. Okay, so I'll start off with a little bit of context, and then I'll talk about my work, or maybe I'll talk around my work to these issues. I grew up in the 70s and the 80s in Toronto, which, if you know Toronto and you know the 70s and 80s, or even the 60s, there was a huge influx of migration from people from the global south. And I'm the son of two immigrants. My mother came from the Philippines, and my father was born in India. And it was my early experience of growing up in the city at this particular time and going to North American schools throughout my life. And, just my experience of film and TV that really started me on this kind of journey to understand what it was to be from the Asian diaspora, and what it was to be a cultural producer and make work and figure out my place in the world, when I wasn't really exposed to really complex or nuanced stories about Asians, or Asian subjectivities or Asian diasporic people. And if we ever saw something about an Asian character or story, they were often oversimplified or orientalized caricatures, largely devoid of anything that I could recognize in my own cultural experience or my lived reality. I feel that the idea of Western progress in the future has been used in malignant ways to brainwash, to justify expansion, colonialism, slavery, genocide, and war. But in the right hands, futurisms for us and by us can be used as a way to celebrate our own unique and parallel ways of seeing, and free us from the dead and racial and national identity algorithms of the day. Futurisms can be used as creative and constructive ways out, but also to show us literally what we can be, what we have been, and what we are. The archive is full of ghosts, and I'm interested in conjuring them in my own complex world that I build, as was the case in this performative photograph untitled 3, where I reimagined a colonial image of a tiger hunt. And I conflated different kinds of fictions about the past, about the future, and about other spaces. The archive is also full of holes that swallow whole people and swallow entire cultures. And since I feel language can also be a pharmacon, which is both a poison and a cure, I started thinking about how I could conjure stories by juxtaposing different kinds of tangible work in different constellations that activated a third experience. I try to create different visual paradoxes, koans, impossible objects, or Rorschach test-like experiences to reveal what's hidden in plain sight, but also to represent something beyond. This is an installation shot from 12 Gates in an exhibition that I had a few years ago called The Closer I Get, the Further I Find. On the left is a sort of logogram abstract image made using Google searches of images, and it's titled Ascending to Outer Space to Find Another Race. The next picture I'll talk about is the one that was in the corner, and it's called Chronomad. And a chronomad is a word that I made up, but then once I made it up, I looked it up and then realized it was a word that already existed, which was perfectly in line with what I was thinking. And the definition is someone who can time travel in nonlinear ways. And it's from a series of experimental propositions that is part of a series called the Pangea series. And in this series, I wanted to imagine migrants as sort of time travelers that crossed time zones and borders and languages and cultures, and that saw the world in unique ways. I often use light as a character in my installations, and I think a lot about immersive experiences and the ways that a viewer moves through the space, what they see first, what they see in their peripheral vision, and what they see next, in the same way a director or an editor might think. This is another work from the same series, the Pangea series, and it's titled No Country. This is also from the series, it's called A Flag for No Country. And in this piece, there's two parallel kind of impetuses to the work. One is I wanted to see what would happen if I mixed all the national flags of all the countries and all of the states that I think should be nations from around the world, and I mixed them in proportion to create a single color. And so I mixed them all together, and predominantly, if you look at sort of the semiotics of the colors in flags, it's really quite interesting. It's also colonial. You can see a lot of colonial traces in how colors kind of come down, but the main colors were, red and white and a little bit of blue, and then and a bunch of other colors. So it came out to this kind of band-aidy taupe color, which I thought was quite strange and curious and interesting. But it's also part of this, series, the Pangea series, which is a bunch of propositions thinking through territory, power, nation states, and how we can rethink them, or how we have gone in this direction. Nation states are not that old when we think of these identities or these nations that seem almost entirely fixed. They're not really fixed. They haven't been in existence for time immemorial. So that was one aspect of this piece. The other aspect is I was thinking a lot about self portraits and my image as a kind of skin. I was thinking about images and skin, and thinking about how the image of my body actually became an image that operated in the world, and how that related in post 9/11 America to a whole set of thoughts and concerns and paranoias and violences. And so I found this kind of equation that, based on my height and my weight, it could figure out sort of the surface area of the skin of my body. And so the scale of this flag is actually my height, which is like 5'9" and 3/4 by about 3.5 feet, which is the surface area of my entire body. So it's kind of a flag of me as well. This is from another series called the All That Glitters series. Normally the idea is all that glitters is gold, but I was really interested in this idea that many things that are not gold can also be, can have value. And I use my old worn out shoes and trick them out in a way to pay homage to the kind of aspirational working class immigrant dollar store bling kind of aesthetic that I saw growing up in Toronto, and that I experienced when I was living in Queens, New York. They're also influenced by Filipino jeepneys and Japanese ceramics. I've also been thinking a lot about the idea of the alien in my work. And this is a still from a short slideshow-like video that uses found images of aliens and UFOs from the internet as the core structure. And historically and politically, linguistically, the term has been used very malignantly, the term alien. But if you flip the script, I'm interested in the way that aliens can also be seen as a powerful frame that we can then take back and we can use. If you think aliens can also be angels, superheroes, gods, spirits, and time travelers. that are also from a world from beyond. So great. Thanks. That's my presentation part.
Thank you. With that, we turn to Nudrat Kamal. Nudrat is a PhD student of comparative literature at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research and teaching focuses on South Asian literature in Urdu and English, particularly in the intersections of environmental humanities, post colonial theory, gender and sexuality studies, and science fiction and fantasy. Look forward to hearing from you, Nudrat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mir. And thank you for the organizers of this film festival for inviting me to speak on something that I find particularly, very exciting. I just wanted to, before I begin, I wanted to clarify that I'm in my presentation, in my slides, I'm using artwork by various South Asian writers who use futuristic elements in their work. And I'm not going to be talking about this artwork, but it's just very fun. And so this is just for people to get to know these artists and look up more of their work. Let me see if I can. Yeah. Yes. Okay, great. So I want to start by asking you all to imagine a scenario. So it's the end of the 21st century, and Mumbai, like all South Asian major cities, has drowned. The few remaining cities which are unsubmerged are ravaged by famine and violence and heat waves. There's a big multinational corporation that is now starting to rule over the subcontinent. So things are pretty bad, right? But at the same time, there are hundreds of zero carbon bastis that have cropped up all over the subcontinent, which which are inhabited and sustained by climate refugees from all over South Asia. Together, collectively, they have started to turn back the temperature in an event that's called the Great Turning. So this is just one future imagining of the many that South Asian sci-fi writers have been articulating in their works in sort of contemporary times. And I'll talk more about this particular story. It's by Indian physicist and sci-fi writer Vandana Singh. It's a personal favorite of mine. I'll talk about this later. But I wanted to start with that and then also pull back and contextualize where these kinds of visions of different kinds of futures, where they're coming from. So the act of imagining futures, alternative, different kinds of futures, is of course a creative endeavor, but it's also very importantly a political and philosophical endeavor, right? So there's things like Plato's Republic, which imagines a utopian city-state, or Al-Farabi's 9th century treatise Al-Madina Al-Fadila, which is also similar. So the imagining of futures has lent itself well to sort of thinking through current political problems, and that's there's a long history of that. But it's only with the advent of what we call Western modernity that these kinds of futuristic visions began to be collected in like the genre that we now know as science fiction, right? And modernity, of course, is particularly suited for futuristic visions because there's this emphasis on scientific and social progress, right? And so there's temporally looking ahead is something built into the project of modernity. But as we also know, modernity is undergirded by the twin projects of capitalism and imperialism. And so it's not a coincidence that the genre of science fiction emerges at the same time, right? And so one of the things that I wanted to also bring to everyone's attention is the ideological debt that the genre of science fiction has to the Western imperial project, right? So various scholars have written about how it is imperative that we look at the sort of development of science fiction as a literary genre within the context of British and French imperialism, which later sort of is taken up by newer forms of imperialism, the US and Japan in the 20th century. And this, you like is obvious when you think about the two most common tropes in science fiction, which are that of the stranger and the strange land, right? So the stranger, it's either an alien, it's maybe a technological creature, or it's a human hybrid. And the strange land, which is like a distant, faraway planet, or maybe a place on our planet that is waiting to be discovered and conquered. And of course, these two pillars, these two metaphorical pillars, also undergird the colonial project as well. So you can see how they would go hand in hand. But at the same time, the genre of science fiction also, because it is, has been interested in concepts of otherness and marginality, it is uniquely positioned to subvert these ideas of imperial power. And writers have been doing it almost as long as the genre has been a thing. But particularly writers from colonized places and formerly colonized places have really sort of taken advantage to good use of the tools that sci-fi sort of provides to subvert and to play around with these kinds of this sort of ideological debt that sci-fi has to colonialism. That's something that is now coming together as post-colonial science fiction. And that's the term post-colonial science fiction, I think, is important for us to keep in mind as we start thinking about what I'm calling South Asian futurisms. Yes, okay. Right. So, so in South Asia, the act of imagining futures, different kinds of futures, goes back to the early 19th century. So, for example, a scholar called Suparno Banerjee says that much of the science fiction being written in the subcontinent since the 19th century recontextualized modernity not only within the Enlightenment tradition, but also within a mythic rebirth of ancient Indian wisdom, or traditions that question modernity itself by imagining alternative ways of being. So, of course, South Asian visions of the future have a more complicated relationship to modernity, because South Asia has a more complicated relationship to modernity, right? Because of its colonial past, but also because of its current role within sort of global capitalism and neo-colonialism. And you see that within like the kinds of works that South Asian sci-fi writers are producing. So I think that if we are sort of able to gather together these texts under the term of South Asian futurisms, this body of work can provide a vibrant poetics to explore these questions of neocolonialism, global capitalism, religious nationalism, and of course, climate change. So I want to talk about two specific texts briefly. One of them is Reunion, but I also wanted to briefly talk about how visions of South Asian futures have shifted. So in the 19th century, and first half of the 20th century, the futuristic visions are more utopian, right? So they have like more anti-colonial, anti-capitalism, sort of nationalist, socialist themes. Sorry. I got distracted by the chat. But so there's a more utopian impulse there, and that shifts post-independence, right? Post 1947, there's a turn to dark futurity, because writers are grappling with the various kinds of failures of the post-colonial states, and that sort of continues into the 21st century, where there is this, where along with all of those other concerns, there are increasing concerns about rising authoritarianism, climate change. There's also this anxiety about surveillance technology in the hands of such authoritarian states and corporations, right? So there's of course a flowering of these kinds of dark texts. I tend to be less interested in the very, very bleak ones and more interested in the texts that obviously acknowledge the darkness, but also offer sort of, roadmaps or like ways out, or offer sort of utopian possibilities within their narratives. And so that's why I wanted to talk about, briefly mention these two. And skip this. Okay. So Bring Your Own Spoon is a short story by a Bangladeshi writer, Saad Hussain. It was published in 2017. It's a really one of my favorite stories. And it's set in this, futuristic dystopian Dhaka, which has completely been, ravaged by climate change. The water is poisoned. Nobody eats the fish or the fruit. Everybody sort of sustains themselves through synthetic sort of food, right? And in this future, every citizen is chipped, and the currency is satellite minutes, which you can sort of use to plug yourself into virtual reality, which is something that most rich people in Dhaka are doing. But what's interesting about the story is that it's not interested in what the rich people are doing, and it takes place almost entirely on the margins, and talks about the people who can't afford the sat minutes, whose bodies are used by nanobots, who are being experimented upon by powerful pharmaceutical companies. And so it's in this sort of very dystopian world that there are these two characters who come together and they decide to open a restaurant. And the idea is, oh, we'll find whatever we can from the wilderness, we'll scavenge it, and we'll cook it together, and open it up for everybody, right? And so this sort of this act of food and cooking and eating it together becomes a form of community building, or sort of collective remembrance, and that in turn leads to this possibility of resistance. And the reason why I really like this story is that there is this sort of ethos, right? So even though the world is really harsh, there is a focus on like being kind and a different way of being, which might seem at odds with the dystopian world around it. But the story really believes in that kind of sort of sociality to combat the dystopia, right? And okay, I'm so sorry. And then so the other story that I started with is Reunion, which again, like Hussein's story, sort of creates a very dystopian world, but focuses on local forms of knowledge and local forms of community to offer a way out. And I think what's most interesting about these kinds of narratives, to me particularly, is that because darker dystopian visions are common, not just in South Asia but around the world, right? It's not, of course, everything is quite bad. And so what I think is needed in this particular moment, especially in South Asia, are texts or imaginings of the future which might offer solutions, right? Which might offer different alternative ways of being that resist this sort of current bleak moment. So of like climate change, for example, in South Asia, or the rising authoritarianism in different parts of South Asia. And so I think if we focus on these kinds of texts, it can lead us to imagine not just sort of local transnational, but even global ways of being in the world that are much more hopeful. And I'll end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this very informative presentation. And we'll be talking more with each of the speakers after everyone presents. So we'll have a chance to dig down deeper with everything we've heard so far from the panelists so far. With that, I turn to Ching-Yi Chen. Ching-Yi Chen is descended from ocean dwellers and the author of The Heart's Traffic, a novel in poems, and Recombinant and Chapbooks to Make Black Paper Sing, and Kundiman for Kin, Information Retrieval for Monsters. Ching-Yi is co-editor of The Revolution Starts at Home, Confronting Intimate Violence Within Activist Communities, and a core member of Massage Parlor Outreach Project. With that, I present to you Ching-Yi Chen.
Thank you, Mir, and all the organizers in the Philly Asian American Film Festival for having me. I'm Ching-Yi Chen. I identify as a blurry writer. also trans and non-binary, community gatherer and educator. And by blurry, I mean that I'm interested in hybrid writing and writing which blurs across genres. And I have a background in community organizing, specifically in Asian American communities in coalition with other communities of color and LGBTQIA communities, especially trans, non-binary, and gender creative communities. And I wanted to start with my own lineage as a writer because that really informs how I think about Asian Futurisms. I trained myself by putting myself in community-based writing workshops organized by community members and leaders who didn't have what they needed and dreamt a new community into being. And I put myself in these workshops because I wanted to learn knowledge that I couldn't get, for instance, in academia, in my K-12 education. So one example is Voices of Our Nations Arts Foundation's VONA, which at the time was the only multi-genre writing workshop providers of color, and Kundiman, which is a national organization dedicated to the creation and cultivation of Asian American creative writing. It was through these community-based writing organizations that I entered into conversations with other writers, developing networks. And in these writing communities, I learned how important it was to contribute to building and maintaining those communities. Our elders dreamt these organizations into being because this kind of support didn't exist for them. And then we learned as we entered these communities how important it was for all of us to keep them alive and healthy. So the image you see is from the cover of Here is a Pen, an anthology of West Coast Kundiman poets, which I co-edited with Margaret Rhee and Debbie Yee. We envisioned this project as both a fundraiser for Kundiman, but also a way for us to develop relationships. At the time I lived in Southern California, and many of us didn't know each other. So this was a way for us to gather, support Kundiman, and also develop and build together. So this is the cover for my first book, The Heart's Traffic, and it's with that same ethos that I found my first publisher and editor, who is named Eloise Klein-Healy. Eloise founded Arctoid Books, which is an imprint which focused on publishing queer women. And as a lesbian poet, Eloise wanted to bring more of these voices to the table. And her goal was to develop a community of writers who could support each other, as well as give us a larger voice in terms of designing our books, covers, etc. And actually, the first version of this cover had some Orientalist elements that I pushed back against, and I was able to do that because of this process. And as an editor, she taught me about the importance of her role in developing and building community resources to create our own media for our own representation. So what Kearney Street Workshop, which is a place that I went for my first workshop, VONA, Kundiman, Arctoid Imprint, have in common is a desire to dream something into being which wasn't there before, which is part of speculating a new world, as well as a history and lineage to engage with, learn about, witness, and document. This is an image which was published as part of Adrienne Marie Brown's All Organizing in Science Fiction. And the basic idea is to imagine a world without poverty, homelessness, prisons, police brutality, borders, oppression, war means that you have to engage in a speculative imagining because that world doesn't currently exist. And this is something that I've taken with me in how I approach my creative work, my community work, and my teaching. So an example of how this principle is used in my community and editorial practices is an anthology that I co-edited called The Revolution Starts at Home, Confronting Intimate Violence Within Activist Communities. And this anthology focuses around community accountability and transformative justice practices. And it seeks community-based solutions to deal with harm and violence without resorting to the criminal justice system. It's actually really exciting right now to see all these new books and resources come out. When this anthology came out, it was originally a DIY zine that was started amongst the editors and a few other folks because there wasn't anything out there. We self-published the zine, and it came out of organic conversations about resources. It was copied and circulated at conferences and by word of mouth. And then we were approached by two publishers to develop the zine into a book anthology. And this was really one of those wanting to have what we needed in our hands as a resource, and then imagining into being. So I'm going to transition into another kind of speculative imagining, which is and I'm going to talk about my book Recombinant, which came out in 2017. So as an Asian American writer who wasn't taught any history about Asians in the Americas in my classes in K through 12, and having to seek that out later, as a college student, I have always been interested in communal history and what's remembered or not, and the archive or the gaps in the archive. So the photo on the left is an 1869 photo, and it doesn't include any of the Chinese laborers who worked on the Transcontinental Railroad. And then on the right, a group of Asian Americans, including descendants of the Chinese railroad workers, recreated an iconic photo on the 145th anniversary of the first Transcontinental Railroad's completion in Utah. And this is an act of speculative imagining. It doesn't erase the former erasure, but it adds another layer into that conversation. And so this is something that I was thinking about when I was thinking about my book. So this is a cover of Recombinant, and this is the kind of speculative imagining that my book engages in. The art on the book cover is from Geraldine Law's Informational Retrieval 131 CPRR. It was originally a wall mural, 37 feet by 5 feet, and a site-specific piece for the traveling exhibition One Way or Another, Asian American Art Now. And it's based on antique maps of the Central Pacific Railroad. I was drawn to this piece because it was based on this history, but also because it looked like a heart, veins, networks, and I thought it reframed possibilities for what these kinds of maps could offer. So I grew up half an hour car ride from the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, and remember visiting the museum on class field trips as a K through 12 student, but the museum's history was not taught to me. This museum was founded by some of the most prominent members of Euro-American Salem, whose families descended from those who profited from the taking of indigenous land in Massachusetts, and who also made their fortune from the trade of the East Indies. So I'm going to focus on one of the threads in the book, which is a sequence of speculative letters, which references two artifacts in the collection of the Peabody Essex Museum. One from the Asian Export Art Collection, Fan 1835 to 1850, number E9631, and one from the Native American Art Collection, Basket, possibly Twana Coast Salish, number E3624. So the artifacts write letters back and forth to each other, analyzing their context and situation, and ultimately hatching a plot to escape the museum together. And then I did research on the background of those who owned the artifacts and donated them and included them in these poems. And then this piece is in response to the PEM's commission of an artist, Michael Lin, to spotlight the collection of Asian export art at PEM. Lin created a mural incorporating these motifs in a large-scale installation, which comprised hundreds of replicas of Mr. Nobody. And then this is a response to that work. So in the final moments that I have, I want to transition to some of my curating work, which engages community members. I work a lot with trans, non-binary, and other gender creative folks because I don't see our stories represented. And I also feel like within Asian American communities, oftentimes when people are curating things, our voices are not there. So this is part of a project called Failure to Conform, which was a performance series highlighting transgender, queer, gender nonconforming, intersex writers and artists in Houston. This is another example of imagining with a group of collaborators, a dream for a kind of building of community, both locally and regionally. We wanted to also build nationally. So we invited a national performer to perform with folks in that local community. And we had applied and received an Idea Fund grant, which funds quote unquote risky projects, which wouldn't normally get funding. So what we did was we organized a story circle for the local community with the intention of gathering stories with folks' permission. And then having that inform the performers that we curated so that it could reflect stories from the communities. And what you're seeing on the screen are the questions that we used in the story circle. We programmed 2 performances. The first was curated around shelter because so many transgender, queer, intersex, gender nonconforming folks in Houston experience housing insecurity, deportation, hurricanes, and weather climate insecurity. And it took place at a shelter which is run by a grassroots group which organizes trans Latina folks. And we highlighted the work of local elders, and then we also paid them and amplified our resources by asking the audience for donations for that space. In the second performance, we were highlighting emerging performers, and we were at a local makerspace. One of the performers at the time had recently gotten a job there and was holding free welding classes for LGBTQI community, so we wanted to highlight that. And then I'm just going to end with this Imagining Trans Future Symposium that basically ended late last night. And it was a culmination of 3 years of co-organizing the Imagining Trans Futures cross-disciplinary research cluster. And the goal was to bring together cross-disciplinary scholars, artists, and community leaders and activists in conversation around imagining trans futures. Basically, one of the reasons we're doing this work is because there are so few trans senior scholars and artists who have been successful in academia. There are many brilliant trans thinkers who operate outside of academia and in the community. So we are literally envisioning ourselves into the future as trans scholars and artists in the field. And I'll just say in wrapping up that our conversations really focused around the idea of trans for trans care. How can we care and shape our own realities and those of our communities? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have so many questions for you, but we will hold our questions until the end. This is a reminder to the audience that if you would like to also participate and ask questions of our participants, of our panelists, you can put them in the live stream comment sections, and I'll read them out towards the end. So feel free to do that. Now I'd like to introduce us to Shimul Chaudhry. Shimul Chaudhry is a new media artist and professor of digital media and creative technology at Florida Southwestern State College. She holds an MFA in digital arts and new media from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her artwork has been featured in the Mary Porter Cessnon Gallery, the Front Gallery, and the Foremost Gallery, among others. She is currently the art director at Mipsters. And with that, Shimul.
Thank you so much, Mir. So Mipsters is what I'm representing today, and Mipsters is a Muslim arts and culture collaborative focusing for the past several years on rewriting the American story by exploring the concept of Muslim futurism. So I want to start out by playing a video, and I'll talk to you about it afterwards. Actually, don't think the video can be played through here, so I can share my screen to play it. Okay.
Mashallah, mashallah. Mashallah, mashallah. Shout out to Mahershala. Holy Almighty Salah. Don't forget about Karbala. 4 days in the gram, man, we were blazing the grams. And that had my grades in the jam. Real talk, that was straining my fam. Losing trust, put crazy in the man. Pop tripping, raising his hands. Mom's in it, glazing the yams. As the homies, I race in the van. Lacing my hands. Now you see sunshine bright. Matador sees at the bullshit path. Campuses were full clip blast. expensive books in the books they cry. Can't lie though, so many coffee, cream, macchiato. Women, I just hit the lotto. MSA was not my Bible. I was tripping off bravado. I ain't know the time of auto. Rap was picking up for throttle. Falling off my studies auto. Mom's on the phone crying. She don't want me to drop out. She ain't moved to the States for a son to be a broken, a joke, and a cop out.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. This that new America. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. We coming to your area.
Tryna get back home with a knee-led. Tryna get back home by the bluegrass. Tryna get back home with a D-net. A place called home, y'all feel that. White boy expect could've seen that. That boy might grant how you mean that. I cannot build walls like a meme trap. Vandalize that wall, Humpty back, dream that. Don't mean that your future ready. Could be dream max, the fake facts, some monster spaghetti. But my boy Nas trap behind bar shit, that's one less Terry. Hijabis calm, Dean and napalm, yo, that's concealed carry. Auntie speak up with a teacup, why you ain't married? E.G. America, better keep up, conversations heavy. I've been at work every day. 2, really got no time to play. 3, strikes and you fall in the straight. The devil he whisper, so I'm gonna pray. 1, I've been at work every day. Hey, really got no time to play. 3, strikes and you fall in the straight. The devil he whisper, so I'm gonna pray.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. This that new America. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. We coming to your area. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. This that new utopia. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. Nobody even heard of you. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. Nobody even heard of you.
All right, so what you just saw was our short film created by Mipsters titled Alhamdu Muslim Futurism. And this, watching this short film is really very important to understand the kind of overall ethos of how we at Mipsters are defining and representing Muslim futurism. So Alhamdu Muslim Futurism as an overarching project includes not only this short film, but also an experiential art exhibition exploring this notion of Muslim futurism as a cultural and artistic approach that imagines a broader Muslim future that is free from the oppression of today and set in a utopic tomorrow of our collective creation. And the reason why I like to start with viewing this film is because the sense of joy and vibrancy and boldness is so prevalent in our film and really is the core of how we view Muslim futurism. But to delve a little bit further into it, Muslim futurism as we define it learns from Afrofuturism as defined by Ingrid Lafleur as an intersectional, multi-temporal, and interdisciplinary approach to the future. It also in part represents an expansion on Malcolm X's description of Black Muslim futurism that centers on a self-sufficient community on the path of collective liberation based on Islamic principles of justice. We also reference the ongoing Palestinian liberation movement, which, much like other indigenous survival struggles, creates a framework for Muslim futurism wherein joy, thriving, and flourishing are bold acts of resistance against oppression. So I'm here today to talk to you specifically about our Muslim futurism exhibition. In the contemporary exhibition landscape, there are very few opportunities for Muslims and all Asians alike and all marginalized groups alike to authentically represent their creative imaginations and craft their narratives with the context of their own artistic visions. And as Chingy mentioned earlier, also there are few opportunities to curate work around self-chosen themes. So for this Alhamdulillah Muslim Futurism project, it was important for us to utilize our ability to curate as a way to amplify and to collectively envision Muslim futurism. So the Alhamdulillah Muslim Futurism exhibition visually and interactively envisions a future where dignity and flourishing and imaginations as Muslims are actualized through the collective body of work contributed by over 30 artists. We dream of worlds and communities where we exist proudly, boldly, and unapologetically. And we utilize this collection of artwork as a way to visualize the future together. So you can see here that we have a collection of work that spans a wide variety of mediums, such as digital illustration, interactive fiction, textile sculpture, visual or virtual reality, and paintings, audio, and all kinds of collage. And all of these works are really meant to contribute to this broader conversation through the unique perspectives of each of the artists who are part of this collection, who have already kind of independently been futuring and imagining futuring from a Muslim context independently. And it was, kind of our goal through curating this work and through inviting artists to participate through open calls globally to enter the traditionally oppressive white institution that is the White Walled Gallery, and to subvert that space and create a collective vision for how our future as Muslims, as Muslim allies, and as folks who are Muslim adjacent could look. So I'm going to skip a little bit forward to this final slide to talk about one major component of our exhibition that MIPsters created ourselves. And this is an interactive immersive installation titled The Mirage. It consists of 3 fabric panels that are spanning from the ceiling to the floor, and a projection on this fabric panels and industrial fans underneath these fabric panels that are blowing gusts of wind into the fabric and creating a billowing action on the screen itself. And the way that we interact with this space is, but prior to entering this room, the user can scan a code, and upon scanning this code, you receive a form on your phone that asks you, what would you contribute to a Muslim future? And upon asking this question, you have a choice of 15 responses. And these 15 selections, contributions, are anything from solidarity to joy to nothing at all, or resistance even. And so upon choosing one of these contributions, one enters this space and stands in this portal that is highlighted on the ground. And as you step into this portal, the sequence of kaleidoscopic visions that are appearing before you kind of break apart, and you are met with a textual response from this mirage. And much like the textual frames that we saw in the film, these are kind of guided phrases that communicate with the viewer in response to the contribution that they make or that they commit to make to the Muslim future. And the design for this was really for us as a collective to create a space where all viewers, regardless of their proximity to Muslim futurism, would be able to engage in a meaningful conversation and also offer up some level of commitment and be held accountable, in at least for the few moments that they are in this space, to engaging with this conversation, which so often in contemporary exhibition landscapes, these engagements that we have in these spaces can be very independent and very inactive. So for us, the visual of this exhibition is representative of Muslim futurism, not only in the collection of work from Muslim and Muslim adjacent artists all over the world, contributing to a vision of a glorious and joyous and radical Muslim future, but also in the act of participating and engaging with these works beyond the standard level of passivity. And that's all I have to say about our exhibition for now.
Thank you, Shimo. That was fascinating. So I'll present Mimi next, Mimi Mondol. Mimi Mondol's latest publication is the Dungeons and Dragons adventure In the Mists of Manivarsha in the anthology Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel. In 2020, her novelette, His Footsteps Through Darkness and Light, was nominated for a Nebula Award, and her short stories have appeared in numerous magazines, including Clark's World, Daily Science Fiction, and the Gollancz Book of South Asian Science Fiction. With that, I present to you Mimi Mondol.
So sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much, Mehrin, and the festival for having me here. And I'm really happy, really honored to have listened to all of your conversations, because I was kind of making notes that I will put into my work, put into what I have to say. I don't have a presentation. I'm mostly talking freeform. So I mostly publish in the science fiction community, science fiction and fantasy community in America. And the larger part of work that I have so far published that you can find has to do with history and mythology, and not so much to do with a future from the present moment of time, which is how most people, most futurism is most commonly defined. So I basically wanted to, sorry, I have a cold, but I wanted to talk about two different parts of futurism, or two different things to relate to futurism and everything that I've heard so far. So one of the things is the thought of futurism as a movement. And very quickly. So I was a literature student, and I was once trained to be a literature teacher, which I'm not really, but the way we learn, especially if we come from the English literature background, the way we learn to define movements or define particular isms also change from time to time, and that's something worth acknowledging. Like I this is what I wrote down in my notes. Until say the almost mid 20th century, a lot of the literary movements that we have in our canon are basically Anglo-American. Like a little older than that, it's only British. So like movements like modernism, like postmodernism, these are often defined by themselves. And these are often defined by a certain group of creators who all know each other. And they're all in the same part of the world. So they are calling themselves postmodernists, right? And once after, especially the 1950s, and also like how when the literary community starts coalescing people who are not from the West, some of these definitions are not created. So for instance, the difference between, say, postmodernism and magical realism. So magical realism is not a name created by any of the authors that are defined by it. And most of these authors did not know each other. Most of these authors are from different parts of the world. So they are not necessarily writing in the same movement. So if you compare it to like slightly older movements, surrealism, things like that, they have a manifesto because they're really some people who know each other. And they're creating in conjunction to each other. And the reason why I guess I brought this up is that I'm very interested in multiple futurisms, and like this panel is already called Asian Futurisms, right? And the thing is, the region we define as Asia is already amorphous, and not all Asians have combined histories, right? Like not all Asians even have interactions with each other, and or sometimes they don't have positive interactions with each other. That is, which is another point that's coming in. God, terrible notes, but basically, so how much does my futurism, for instance, contradict or disrupt another person's futurism? Like this is something I learned from reading Afrofuturism authors, Afrofuturism as opposed to African futurism, which I will not really get into because it's not directly an Asian concern. But especially when you're writing Afrofuturism or any other futurism from the West, from diasporic communities, where people from very different histories are probably coexisting next to each other. Like my neighbor may have come from an ancestry that has never interacted with me, right? So like that person's ancestry and my ancestry this is the first point that it's interacting. So like with me and that person. So like if we are creating futures that draw from the history that, we're coming out of, does my future include that person? But that also does my future include that person's history? And then that's why I wanted to bring in like Chingyin's point about how revising history is like so important to futurism, because we the past moment does flow into the present, and the present is present is not even a real moment, right? Like goes from the past every second to the future. The present is a very small barrier, almost very small entrance, let's say. And so what we imagine of the future very strongly depends on what we expect, what we know our history to be. And as a South Asian writer who's of a Dalit background, and there isn't a lot of integration of Dalit people in South Asian history, that we have written history and so on, even literature, like you mostly see Dalits as like extremely outlier characters, not really treated very well, but you don't really see what their inner lives are like. Don't really see what their own communities are like. And it's still very hard for me to like some kind of like even a speculative history of, say, people who were actually my ancestors, because I have no material on, and no historical material on how people lived, not even much historical material on how our ancestries progressed within the larger South Asian region. Which also brings me to a point that a lot of our futurism conversations are, the way Nadrat pointed out a little bit, like most of us are interested in positive futurisms and not dystopias, right? And considering that we live in a dystopia right now, like dystopia can't get more imaginative, like it can't get worse. Everything's pretty much already happened. And even like fiction writers who identify more closely as science fiction writers primarily, the biggest challenge for us right now is how to write a futurism. When you're writing a futurism that's positive, it's actually easy to write negatives because everybody dies. Bad things happening to everybody. But when you're talking about good things happening to people, that actually gets very complicated, because sometimes your good thing is another person's bad thing, and vice versa, right? And so I wanted to talk about two things. For instance, the thing that I pointed out about not all futurisms can coexist, and the larger ground that you can cover essentially is an act of radical empathy and openness, that like, that person's ancestor, like say if you're an Afrofuturist, and you're largely writing about Black people, even in history, but there were also other people who still existed in that world. So if you're any futurism that you're using, you may not cover that part of the world in your story, but it's still existing. That part of the world still exists. And anytime somebody comes in from that part of the world, you can't possibly ignore that person. And as a Dalit writer and a futurist, I guess, God, I mean, one of the criticisms sometimes I hear about myself, sometimes not to my face, is that I am disrupting the person of color post-colonial solidarity in futurism by critiquing people who are also people of color in America, upper caste Hindu people. And the thing is, it's kind of eugenicistic to exclude a certain community just because it's small, especially if there's somebody else speaking up, and also especially if it's a community that fits in, like I wrote here, fits in uncomfortably with the larger uplifting narrative. So that's one small point I wanted to make. And then, like, how do we not do that though? Like, most of us, we can't be experts in like every other marginalization in the world, right? And a large part of the conversation among science fiction writers, like that I know, like myself, I guess, is that I guess you do your best, and you stay open to the possibility that what you're creating right now may not be the most positive thing in another 10 years. Another group, somebody that you're probably writing in one word may not be one word. Like I before I came to America, I didn't know, like, say, Arctic indigenous groups did not like to be called the E word, I guess. And the first time I heard it, I mean, a lot of us, maybe not me personally, maybe not a lot of us who are actively trained to be more liberal, but a lot of people try to say, well, that's not very significant. Like, that little difference that one person is bringing to the table is probably ignorable. And that's probably not the best way of going about creating futurisms. And I kind of wanted to end with, because I'm pretty close to the end, that having multiple futurisms which probably don't collapse into one is probably a thing, because some narratives cannot be fitted into each other, and sitting at this present moment, we can't really completely conclusively say that that narrative is wrong or this narrative is correct. So, like, having a number of them coexist will probably always be the multiple futurisms as opposed to one futurism. That's pretty much all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really glad, Mimi, that we ended the presentations with you. We will have time for some discussions now, and I'll ask some of you more sort of specific questions. But your talk made me think about, Mimi, is about the notion of disruption and basically the complicating our notions of not just history, but also even aspiration and coexistence. One of the philosophers I like a lot, who's also a poet and writer, a thinker, is Edward Glissant. And one of the things I learned, his writings are complex, but one of the things I gathered from him is, from his writing, from his work, is that there is a way to appreciate each other by appreciating each other's difference and not accepting that we are sort of universally the same. I mean, that is something I think all of us here in our various projects are pushing back against. I was very struck by, in terms of taking away from this panel, the community-based and collective practices that Chingy and Shimul emphasized, and the aspirational sort of futurisms that both of you, Shimul, Chingy, as well as Nudruth, sort of touched upon. And I appreciate the way Mimi then took that and complicated it a bit, because we live in a complex world, and that is the way we have to engage with these difficult and challenging issues. I I know it appears to me from all of your work, from what I've known before, and then now a deeper dive into it through your presentations, you're all pushing back against colonialism, including settler colonialism, imperialism, Orientalism, certain kinds of heteronormativities, in all of your works, Jarrett, Anudrat, Shimul, Mimi, and Chingy. So with that, I have some specific, and one point I did want to make, and maybe you and I can talk about it later, is I want to give some space to the present. From my sort of Zen practices, I'm aware that the present is where the future and the past can be reconciled. So the present is not simply a series of moments, but really a very charged moment where what has happened in the past and what may happen in the future can coexist, and that is the moment that the future can be changed. And I absolutely appreciate your point, Mimi, that from that moment, many futures can arc out. And in our creative practices, in our community practices, that is what we are looking for. So it's been a while, Jared, since we called on you. You've been quiet so far. I wanted to, in your presentation, I was very struck by the series on the sneakers, and one question sort of came to my mind is, in this cultural production that you're engaged in, artistic production, your artistic production takes place in a larger cultural context of cultural production of art in the US or globally. Your work has been exhibited outside of the US, right? You are also, you have roots in many different places. What are the pragmatic benefits and pitfalls of framing this cultural production through the lens of Asian futurisms?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll answer a smaller question and then get to that the bigger question. So when I was making that work, that series of work, I was thinking about two particular communities and a few different experiences, and I was thinking very particularly about Flemington Park in Toronto, which is where a lot, it's been called an arrival city. It's where a lot of immigrants, migrants come, and kind of it's like a entrance point into the city. It's been written about. On its good days, it's called an arrival city. On its bad days, it's called an immigrant ghetto, right? And so I was interested in seeing some of that aesthetic represented, because I just don't really see it. And there's something about that dollar store immigrant bling, knockoff bags, big fake gold necklaces that I wanted to own in a way. And it was related very specifically to this place that I grew up for a time, and also where I was having an exhibition where I installed those works, which was in Queens, New York. And so I lived in Queens for a while, and I also wanted to draw parallels between these aesthetics that I saw in Queens, in deep Queens. There's like this thing happens, that I don't see. And in the art world, there's sometimes artwork can be very top down. It's very designed in a way. There's a logic to even the way color is used. And I was more interested in the noise and in the cacophony, in a way similar to what Mimi's talking about, the kind of multiple voices that are happening at the same time. But I was also interested in the grime and the dirt and the smell of our food. I was interested in the lived experience of walking and what that does to create something. So I wanted to start off in a hyper local way, by grounding that work, and then also my experiences earlier on in the Philippines and my relationship to Filipino jeepneys, which are these beautiful, incredible aesthetic masterpieces that aren't meant to be art, but are just next level, incredible pieces of cultural production with a rich history. And then to think about, okay, so now that's part of how I was thinking about that work. The frame of Asian futurism is also, yes, it's like a pharmacon. It's like an ambivalent sort of framing. I think there are certain ways that Mimi articulated that I have a discomfort with it, right? Like Asian futurism. Okay, the Asia is like so many nation states. It's actually so many ethnicities, it's so many castes, it's so many religions, it's so many perspectives. And then there's Asian diasporic experiences, which are mashups of all of those. And it's different, like if you're in one city or in one town, or, me, I'm of mixed descent. So the idea of being Asian is also like a huge question, what does that even mean for me and how does that function? And I think within the discourse of futurisms that's happening right now, we've been talking about Afrofuturism, there's kind of a Latinx futurism, there's indigenous futurisms. I feel like there is a conversation about radical imagining, and based on this North American structure, right? Asian is a big category, right? In these, like, I don't know, it's like 4 or 5 different major groups that they discuss when they're discussing race and culture in America. And so while completely understanding and respecting that it's problematic in so many different ways because we are so diverse, and we shouldn't just be positivist, because that's identity politics can be a form of nationalism light, or it could embed different kinds of hegemonic systems that are very problematic. I think it's still important, given the lexicon of how we're talking about things in America, to have some representation in this way. Because I do think, whether we agree with complexity or not, which I think all of us do, there is still the lingua franca of the day, which is, that Asian, perceived from outside of our culture, is actually considered a monolith. And there are so many problems through the colonial lens that are still imposed upon brown and the many sort of colors within the Asian spectrum. And they are, I think, in my experience, very particularly malignant in very specific ways in North America, that I think the idea of Asian futurism, which I feel could also be called Asian diasporic futurism, would address in a way that makes sense in relation to the world that we're living in right now. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that is why, it is important to have the S in the futurisms. And it's, if we're talking about diaspora, there's a lot of talk of Asian or South Asian diasporas, and there is no one diaspora, as Mimi and others have pointed out, right? So there too, it's diasporas. But I'd like to sort of, speaking of from that perspective, get to sort of a question for both Chingy and Shimul, but in a different way. And if we can just take a couple of minutes each to answer. From Chingy's work, I absolutely appreciate and respect that the work is done for the communities that you identify with, right? Who have been there for you, and you're sort of in a symbiotic relationship and feedback loop with it. But for the, let's say, if for those of us who may not identify as queer or trans, I do still think that lens and perspective, the queer and trans lens and perspective, is incredibly important to the rest of us, right? Like, so I'd wanted to hear from you how that lens specifically, without reifying it in any way, but how that lens is specifically important in imagining different futures for all of us, just like Asian Futurisms is ultimately for each of us, but has something to say to the broader culture. And I'd be interested in hearing about you from that. And similarly to from Shimul, how Muslim Futurisms also can be subversive that way and is important for others who may not identify in that way. So Chingy first, and then Shimul, please.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I think that we always, so the Imagining Trans Future Symposium, which just happened last week, the way that we've organized our events, we always have a public component where everyone is invited. And we think it's actually really important so that other folks can see the brilliance of these works, and also include trans thinkers and researchers and artists in, within their own curation or their own projects. So, but I think that it's also important for us to have our own space so that we can also talk to each other. So I think it's always thinking about both of those at the same time.
And from our end, I think that's something that we recognized very early on in this project when choosing to define it very specifically as Muslim futurism and being explicit about the connection to Afrofuturism. That limiting factor is something that you can't really escape from, that when you're choosing to contextualize it within a particular subset. But for us, we see Muslim futurism as a practice, as a framework, and utilizing, as I said earlier, utilizing lessons and thought processes from Black Muslim futurism, from thinkers like Malcolm X, and also from the current Palestinian resistance movement is really kind of the foundation for how we visualize communicating the need for a quote unquote better future. And it was very interesting for us as we were creating these frameworks and thinking about our work as a system in which we can practice the act of futuring through this mode of creativity. We were releasing our film, our Alhamdulillah Muslim Futurism film, at a time when the Palestinian conflict, which I hate using that word, but for lack of a better word, the conflict was very prevalent in our, on the mainstream Western eye, May 2021. And we kind of had this internal battle. Is it relevant for us to share our creativity and share our work when there is, this very active situation happening? And how do we contribute to this conversation and also learn from this movement without detracting from the very real happenings of today? And for us, it was important for us to contextualize that our idea of futurisms, Muslim futurisms, is learning from all of these different points and acting as we've all kind of touched on, using joy as resistance. And for us, that limiting factor is there, and it's something that we acknowledge, but also we have to do it anyways. And that's been kind of the driving force, learning from Islamic perspectives on justice and on thriving. That was kind of the centering focus throughout the catalyst of this project.
Thank you. And in both your and Jared's work, I do see that that thread of turning certain kinds of, certainly in the Mipsters video, turning heteronormativity and norms on their head about dress and attire and what is possible. Jared mentioned colors, same, because even in the prevailing white privileged context, whether it's academia, whether it's any of the spaces that we inhabit, as you get further, if you're lucky enough to get further up the echelon, you see that the colors and loudness of colors and certain ways of dressing and jewelry and how you present yourself is just not acceptable. So if you want to get ahead and be successful in the mainstream. So I really sort of, I hope I'm not misreading that into it, but that very much spoke to me about both your works. With that, I'd like to turn to Nudrat. Your work is in South Asian literature. You are from Pakistan. There are, and as Shimul just mentioned, talking about some of these things when real, very intractable issues are taking place on the ground in some of our countries of origin. I'm from Bangladesh myself, and is sometimes, how to reconcile the two. So I'll ask you a very, I hope not too difficult a question, but why do you think, how do you think this idea of utopian possibilities, and again, I very much appreciated the aspirational component of it, as is apparent in your and Shimul's work and others here, this idea of utopian possibilities within dystopia, how is it relevant to this what we're going through like at the moment in South Asia? South Asia as a region, I say that very specifically, and because I take to heart Mimi's proposition that we are each different in our own ways. But how can these utopian possibilities speak to what is happening, what happens on the ground, as you're well aware of?
Right. I mean, so I think just the act of imagining futures, right, or science fiction as a genre itself is deeply political, and so even dystopian visions do very important work, in fact, of sort of critiquing, contemporary problems, and they have done so, right, in South Asia and also more globally. I think for this particular moment, because things do seem to be coming to a head globally, but also within South Asia, right? There's a lot of bleakness, and I think it can be easy to sort of for despair to set in. So that can lead to a kind of paralysis of okay, things are bad, and they're like extremely bad in all of these ways, and so there's no way out, right? And I think that what this kind of like you can, I like the phrase, this is a scholarly term, critical or heterotopic dystopia, or there's also another term called hope punk, right? So what that does is that it acknowledges, it is not utopian per se, it's not imagining a perfect world, it is acknowledging that the world has all of these very intense structural problems that are affecting various groups in these specific ways. But then it also sort of, in a way, romanticizes the hard work needed to get out of that, right? And I think for especially young people in South Asia, so for example, the students I would teach, I think that that really sort of connects to them, this idea that no, okay, things are bad, but these are concrete ways in which we can make them better. And it's the trying, right? It is just it's just sort of the effort of coming together, of building communities and resisting in these ways, that I think these kinds of narratives, we can call them more hope punk narratives, right? That I think are very much needed, instead of like this complacent, okay, things are really bad, so what do we do? So I do find that this is particularly relevant for the contemporary South Asian moment. Yes.
No, I read this somewhere recently. Thank you for that. That cynicism is not a place of creativity. So,
Right.
and that's exactly what your points
Exactly.
reminded us.
Mhm.
And that community-based practices can be part of these, that Chingin sort of specifically went through in their slides, can be part of these wonderful stories, or interesting stories, or thought-provoking, or complicated or disturbing stories that an art that we can sort of experience in the world, like opening up a food pantry or food kitchen in the midst with no resources available, like you mentioned in your story. So we can talk forever, but I'm being told we need to wrap up. I'll give each one like a lightning round, a second, like if there's any one word or a phrase you want to say. I'm just gonna quote Mipsters here and say what is coming is better than what has gone by, but it is up to all of us to do that hard work. So those are my last words. Each of you in turn, go. And just a minute, like just a couple seconds. Nudrat?
I mean, I think the ethos of hope punk is something I would like to end on, right? The sort of call to action in a hopeful way.
Mimi? You're on mute.
I'm sorry. Yeah, again, I just want to follow from that. So yes, a lot of the work that, I mean, Nudrat and I both talked about science fiction writers a lot. And a lot of the work science fiction writers are doing right now has basically to do with imagining futures where the framework of current society doesn't just carry on, because that is not a very positive framework. So we're also having to think about how to imagine societies where the large, the thing that I said in my conversation, that this is the theory that the larger number of people coexist together, etc. How does a world like that look? How are the actual interactions of people? How are the power equations? What do you do in your 24 hours? And that is the kind of work a lot of us are doing, and that is the kind of work, even I'm a science fiction editor as well, and that's the kind of work I'm interested in as an editor, to work that actually shows the way, like work that actually is almost instructional about how to live
Thank
in
you.
a better way. Yeah.
Like DIY. Shimul, Chingy, Jarrett. And just, we're right on time.
My one-liner is that however we build the future, it has to be together.
Yeah, I was gonna say that taking Mimi's point, we need to be working together, and also on the ground, as culture makers, we need to be working with folks who maybe don't identify as artists, writers. We all have a role to play in making a better world.
And thank you.
And I think a lot about vision in my work, and I've been thinking a lot about vision in this panel. And vision, when you look at something, you're not just seeing that thing as data, you're actually drawing on history to figure out what that thing is. And there's a way that looking into the future sort of frees up our minds in order to understand where we are in the present and where we've been in the past. And one thing I'd like to just sort of, I think we're all kind of saying it in different ways as well, is that this vision or these visions need to be complex and nuanced, and they're intrinsically laden with trapdoors, but also with like incredible potentialities.
Thank you so much. And with that, it's a wrap. Thank you to everyone, all of you. This was wonderful. And Brett, thank you for managing the technical aspects of this presentation.